Hello. Hello, everybody. Right, I hope you're doing well. Sorry, I'm just, as usual, I've got my control desk, so for your chat intervention, so that's it. Hello to everybody, and I hope you're doing well. For this last week before the last week, the week before the last week, because I think we have 2 more weeks to go, because then we'll have I have some convocation for the back and so on, so I don't think I'll be in capacity to have these online classes. I don't know, we'll see. Anyway, so I hope everybody's had a good weekend and that you're ready for this early morning lesson. Right, if you remember, hello, good morning. Right, so my aim for this week, for between today and next Friday, is to complete the question of societies at war, so that next week, which will be certainly the last full week for us, we'll be able to study the consequences of the war and to give you the major elements to understand next year, okay? And especially, so pointing about the human toll, the economic toll, 2 specific questions, one dealing with the Armenian, the genocide on Armenians in Turkey, the other one dealing with the Bolshevik Revolution, and the memories of the war, okay? And that's, and we'll be done with this lesson, okay? That's it. So, if you remember, last Friday, we studied, so we're in the second part, societies at war, and we studied the fact that the war happened on many fronts. As a global reminder, it happened on global fronts under several scopes. Firstly, battles took place on both the land, like Battle of the Marne, Battle of the Somme. Some were a mix of land battle and sea battles. That was the case in Gallipoli, if you remember. Boats, the British boats landed in Gallipoli after trying to cross the Dardanelles Strait. And then you had a trench war in Gallipoli. And also, I've shown you that there were bombings from the very beginning of the war with the Germans bombing some British cities. Scarborough was one of them, if you remember. That's something we have studied. Hello to those coming in and joining. Be welcome. That's the first point. Secondly, it was also a global war, and a war on many fronts, because from the beginning in Central Europe to the quick expansion of the war to the major empires and major nations, Germany, Austria, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, France, the UK, Italy, and then all of Europe, most of Europe was involved in the war. In 1917, the USA would join, and I've told you why, because the Germans were starting attacking American boats delivering food. I will show you a document in a few minutes about this. And the colonies, India, Africa, the Middle East, were also a place of fighting. So, hence the name of a global war, the First World War, which was certainly the first total war. And to prove it was a total war, today we're going to study the changes, the role played by the non-fighters. Okay, we're going to study the role played by the non-fighters. And as I've told you, so let me show you another document which will be made available at the end of the lesson. Okay, you will have all this in a summary. So I've drawn this mind map and adapted it to what we're doing. And I have to pay my dues to a colleague of mine working in Strasbourg, a history and geography teacher, Julien Ebersold. This is this is a very relevant, I can say it because it was not mine at first, so I'm not self-congratulating, but that's a very clever summary of why World War I was a total war. And if you can see, there is a dotted line. There is a dotted line on this mind map or on this flow chart. On the left, on the top left, what we've studied so far, which is the fighting itself. And the fighting was about mass death. That's something we've seen already, right? With the trenches and the people being bombed and shelled and gassed permanently, which led to a brutalization of war, extreme violence and extreme traumas. This was made possible thanks to armaments. That's something we've already discussed with the industrialization of war, okay? Using industrial armaments, the machine guns, the cannons, the planes, and so on. Also, the fact that civilian casualties were triggered by war violence, for example, in Scarborough. And the fact is that it was a war of attrition. And that means a strategy to exhaust the enemy's resistance. Okay? This is what we have studied. Now, to have all this possible and lasting for 4 years and a half, you need a war effort. That means, and that's, you can move to the second balloon, the second sphere, you need a war economy. Okay? You need an economic organization that revolves around the war. Because the war was massive. And so you needed an economy which was also fully dedicated to winning the war. And this is how war can also be called an industrial war. Not only because it was a massive commitment by soldiers and officers, but also because you had to reorganize production, industrial production and agricultural production with war as a main aim, the main target. And to do this, you need to fully, that's the bottom of the second sphere, you need a full mobilization of societies, okay? And societies mean the people not fighting. And you call this the war effort. But to have this, and that's going to be my last point, you need the people to accept war. If you want all people being involved in war production, you need their full commitment into it. What you call consent or consenting. Okay? To consent doesn't mean you love war. It means you accept it. Okay? And that means that the civilians have to undergo their own sufferings, and the governments have to make sure that they are followed by their opinion. Because if you lose the public opinion supports to war, then you won't be able to take them into the war effort. That's clear? Okay. So, historians have called this consent to war. Okay? Actually, there is still a debate whether people willfully consented to war, or if the consent was fabricated, was made by the government. In the UK, the industrial, economic, and political commitment to the war was called the Home Front. And this is what we're going to study today. Okay? Before we start, I'd like to show you, so I'm going to insist on the UK mostly, okay? It's going to be based on the British experience mostly, okay? Is there any questions so far? Is there any questions so far about this? Sorry, I have to check my... No, it's fine. I don't seem... Okay, that's clear? So that's something we're going to see in... And normally, when I teach this in class, it's a group work, and I give plenty of documents to study. So the documents you're going to see right now are parts of the document we tend to study and see. The question about this document is generally, to what extent was the British government instrumental in changing people's mind in the Great War? To what extent was the British government instrumental in changing people's minds in the Great War? Before we move on to Britain, just one French document, if you allow me. I don't know why I can't integrate images this morning. Here we go. Right. That's a French document because if you were not in the OIB, you would mostly focus on the French experience of the war. So I just do that because I find it very interesting. As you can see, this document is dated back to the early moments of the First World War, and it's called Pourquoi nous vaincrons? Why we win? Why eventually we'll win. And it's called National Unity or Sacred Union. What was part of societies being able to hold for so long in the war? And that was true in France, and that would be true in the UK. To some extent, that would be true in Germany. Okay, is that during the war, from the summer of 1914 to the end of 1918, France and the UK were able to mobilize their population. They were able to maintain the unity of their population. And this document is quite interesting because you can see a row of French people, I should say French men actually, as you can see. And if you look at the list, you can see that it's a quite interesting one because it is supposed to be a gathering, people joining hands of all the political tendencies in France. Les radicaux were those in power. They represent, if you want, a left-wing center. The radical were highly Republican. They were Republican. They were the one who forged and framed la laïcité. So they were very, defiant over the church and so on. And they were the one who were leading the government during the war. Okay, the wartime government in France revolved. It was a unity government, but it revolved around this party called Le Parti Radical, or Les Radicaux. So globally, the centrist. Just aside, you can see la CGT. That means the hardliners, the leftist hardliners, the trade unionists, the workers, people always ready to go on strike for their rights, but they would not go on strike during the war, according to this document, because they were willing the French victory. They were allied to socialists and to Catholics. You can see the priest in his black outfit and the promoters of monarchy, the royalist, the monarchist, sorry. So, what does that mean? Of course, that's propaganda. La mobilisation a fait taire toutes les querelles privées. Lorsque la guerre a éclaté, les luttes intestines qui déchiraient la France ont été vite oubliées. That, of course, is quite questionable, but that's propaganda. Okay, so. Chacun n'a songé qu'à défendre le sol national contre l'envahisseur. C'est à la séance de la Chambre des députés du 4 août 1914 que s'est levée, a dit le président de la République Raymond Poincaré, l'union sacrée qui, à travers l'histoire, sera l'honneur du pays. Tous les partis politiques se sont tendus la main, depuis les syndicalistes et les socialistes jusqu'aux catholiques et aux royalistes. Cette trêve des partis a fait l'admiration du monde entier. Elle contribuera pour une grande part à la réalisation de la victoire décisive. L'Allemagne comptait nous trouver désunis devant son agression. Elle s'est grossièrement trompée. Jusqu'au bout, cette unité nationale, cette union sacrée persisteront. Méditons ces paroles que M. Viviani, c'est le chef du gouvernement, prononçait dans son admirable déclaration du 22 décembre 1914 à la Chambre des députés. Continuons de préserver de toute atteinte, a dit le président du Conseil, cette union sacrée. Aujourd'hui, comme hier, comme demain, n'ayons qu'un cri, la victoire, qu'une vision, la patrie, qu'un idéal, le droit. Quoi qu'il arrive, nous resterons unis. La victoire est à ce prix, nous vaincrons. So, as you can see from the I've got a question about why the French were called les radicaux. Don't forget one thing. Radicals mean those at the root. Radical en français, juste un petit point en français puisqu'on est sur le français. Radical, c'est ce qui est à la racine de. D'accord ? Et en l'occurrence, à la racine de la République. Donc le mot radical, effectivement, a l'autre sens, c'est quand vous revenez à la racine, vous êtes impur, voilà, vous êtes sans mélange et sans nuance. C'est ça que veut dire, oui, le radicals en anglais veut effectivement, tu as raison Kenzo, de dire ça. En France, radical, c'est ceux qui sont à la racine du projet républicain. C'est ça que ça signifie, en fait, fondamentalement. Ils sont radicalement républicains. Ça ne veut pas dire qu'ils sont radicaux au sens social du terme. Ils sont radicalement républicains. La seule chose sur laquelle ils ne négocient pas, c'est leur attachement à la République. Mais ils peuvent être de droite. Il y a des radicaux de droite, il y a des radicaux de gauche. Voilà. Donc on va dire qu'ils sont... Ce qui les caractérise, c'est d'être plutôt au centre de l'échiquier politique, c'est-à-dire ils ont des éléments de conservatisme et des éléments de progressisme social, mais ils sont radicalement républicains. C'est ça le sens de radical. D'accord ? Effectivement, ils sont pas radicaux, c'est pas des black blocs, quoi, c'est sûr. Pas trop les radicaux de la Troisième République française. D'accord ? J'espère avoir éclairé un petit peu l'éclairage. Éclairer l'explication, pardon. Éclairer l'éclairage. Éclairer l'explication. Okay? Good. So, that document is just here to show you, I don't have the time to expand on the French case. It's just a way to prove that from the very beginning of the war, for the states, it was very important for the governments, it was very important to maintain the national unity. And maintaining the national unity was on the two ends of the war. On the one end, it was, the first end was fighting, okay, and the second one was what the British would call the home front. People not fighting, but being involved in the war. Okay? So, right, let's move on with various documents. And we're going to get into the British case first. So, in the United Kingdom, the first decision which was taken was something called the Defense of the Realm Act. The DORA. D-O-R-A. And, sorry, the DORA, so Defense of the Realm Act, was an act passed by the British Parliament in August 1914. So, in the very first days of the war. And so this DORA, I'm going to project you a summary to go faster on this. This is a time of posters you could find on the British walls and in the British public places, like theaters, schools, the grocers. I mean, everywhere the British people would go in 1914. And the defense of the realm was there to avoid a German invasion, because there was a fear that the Germans might be able to cross the channel from the continent to the UK. So the aim was to say we should defend the realm. The realm is another word for the kingdom. Okay, so Defense of the Realm Act. Let me tell you an interesting story. In England, you tend to say kingdom more than realm. And I think I told you this last year. Realm is the word from French origin. It's royaume. Okay, royaume, realm. Kingdom comes from the German. Okay, König, king in German. And so it was decided to call it Defense of the Realm to show that the UK was more of French inspiration than German inspiration. You may also know that for this reason, the British family changed its family name. They were called Saxe-Coburg, which is German, and they changed it to Windsor, which sounds more British, just to cut the links they had with Germany. I don't know if you knew about this. So Defense of the Realm. One example, from the beginning, the government made sure people would protect the kingdom. For example, discussion in public of naval and military matters may convey information to the enemy. It means that people were not allowed in the UK to discuss publicly of military matters. They were not supposed to discuss the battles publicly or in the street, for example. They were not supposed to be able to discuss defeats or victories in the war in public to avoid the spies. Okay, to avoid the spies. Let me give you a list of what people were and were not allowed to do with the Defense of the Realm Act. Okay, here we go. So, that's my lesson. So, remember, the adaptation was made little by little because the lasting war was not foreseen. Economy and society had to adapt. Firstly, as you know, it started with anti-German propaganda. It started with anti-German propaganda in the first time of the war. You remember this? That's something we've studied. And this is from December 1914, January 1915. Men of Britain, will you stand this? And look at the bottom. This is what the German raiders did. The German raiders did this. So you have to enlist. You have to join the army, and you have to make sure that the Germans will be defeated. Okay? Sorry, I'm just... Right. Also, at the third bullet point, the government took measures to control the life of the British. So it means that, of course, the government took measures which changed the people's lives. And that's called the Defense of the Realm Act, August 1914. So just a list. You couldn't talk about naval or military matters. That's something I've just shown you. Also, you could be punished, arrested, if you spread rumors about the military things going on. Like, oh, I've got a cousin, or my neighbor's brother is fighting in Flanders, in Belgium, and I've heard that. You were not supposed to do that, and you could be arrested or given a fine, a financial penalty. You could not fly a kite. A kite? That's a kid's game you play, or it can be an adult's game that you play on the beaches. It's an object which flies in the wind. That's a kite. You were not allowed to do that because it could tell the German Zeppelins, the German bombers, where to bomb. For the same reason, you couldn't do bonfires on the beaches, like, you gather with friends and you light a fire. You couldn't do that. You couldn't have fireworks being fired. Also, you could not give bread to animals because very soon the British feared that a German blockade could prevent the UK from importing food and cereals. So food was not supposed to go to animals. The priority was to keep them for people. Okay? If you broke these rules, that's the second yellow line, the British government, you could be tried. You could be sent to a court. Also, censorship was established. It means that the government was able to censor pieces of news. I like the last line. In the pubs, which had restricted opening hours, the pubs could open for less time, for a lesser span of time, and beer was watered down. It means that the degree of alcohol in beer was lowered by adding more water. And this aimed at two things. Firstly, beer is cereals. So by putting more water into the beer, you would save some cereals for daily food. And also, it would keep the population to a lower degree of, alcoholic consumption. And so maybe to keep more people more aware, okay? So, I don't know if you see what I mean here, but that means clearly that there was a will by the British government to control the daily life of the population, because this population was considered to be a full agent in the war. Okay? This is why the British call this the home front. You were not fighting directly on the front, but by staying at home and by being involved in the war at home, then you would also participate in the war. Okay, that's clear? Good. So, how could people be involved in the war? How could the population be involved in the war? Firstly, the British people could finance the war. Okay. Right. What you have to consider is that states in Europe had to finance the war for, as I've told you, 4 years and a half. It means that little by little, budgets, the fiscal policies in the states were totally transformed by the war. In 1915 and 16, half of the British budget would go to the war. In 1915 and 16, half of the British budget would go into the war effort. And so you have three possibilities to finance a war. You have three possibilities to finance a war. Possibility number one, you increase the taxes. You increase the taxes. And this is, of course, something governments would do. Secondly, you borrow money from foreign states, but that creates debts. And this is how the United States of America would get out of the war much wealthier than before, because the USA would lend a lot of money to France and the UK and other countries. The third thing you can do is do this. You can create and you can start something called war loans. War loans. And what are war loans? Exactly this. Okay. Sorry. Okay. War loans. Turn your silver into bullets at the post office. So you would bring your money, you would bring your savings, and you would invest in what you call treasury bonds or state bonds. That means you give money, you lend money to the state, and the state will pay you back one day, maybe. Normally they're supposed to pay you back. And that enables the state to gather the people's money, the people's private money, to finance the war. Okay? So that's one part of how the population was mobilized in the war. It was the financial mobilization. Okay? So the state would increase taxes, and the state would also organize something called war loans. When the citizens, it existed in France too, it existed in Germany too,